Well, it's time now for another look at the press preview. Here's that. Hello there, you're watching the press preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking through the headlines with the chief leader writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha, and political journalist Isabel Oakeshott. So very good evening to both of you. So let's take a look then at what's on the front pages. And the Metro leads on the bombings in Sri Lanka, reporting that the Foreign Office is warning Britons not to travel to the country because more terror attacks may take place. The Telegraph splashes on two cabinet ministers publicly denying leaking details of Huawei's future role in the UK's 5G mobile network at a National Security Council meeting. While The Guardian goes with cabinet members who were at that gathering, they say they've been sent an ultimatum by a Whitehall official to confess or deny the leak. The Eye also leads with that story, saying there are calls for police to investigate ministers over the security leak. And The Times says private school head teachers have defended the sector by claiming it's saving taxpayers £20 billion a year. Meanwhile, the Daily Mail leads on Sir Mo Farah's alleged spat in a hotel, which the Olympian strongly denies. And the Financial Times reports that Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank have abandoned their merger talks, which could open the door for foreign buyers to acquire the smaller of the Frankfurt-based rivals. So lots of issues to get our teeth into there with Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott. And we're kicking off with another day of headlines regarding the issue of Huawei, the Chinese technology company. There's the Eye's headline, calls for a police investigation, the calls for them to investigate ministers over this leak from a National Security Council meeting.
Yes, and I would imagine that would involve, for example, going through ministers' phone records and their electronic communications, which would be an extraordinarily serious step to take. However, to have a leak from the National Security Council like this is really very, very serious. The consequences of that is that spy chiefs may no longer feel safe divulging the most sensitive of information in that forum, which is really, unique in what it does. And I understand, therefore, why there is this pressure to get to the bottom of it. But I think what it shows, I think it's symptomatic of a much deeper malaise, which is just this complete sense of lack of responsibility on the part of the cabinet at this time. You know, this type of routine leaking has become almost a reflex for cabinet ministers over a period not just of months now, but well over a year, really since Theresa May lost her majority. And it's just now a kind of symbol of the breakdown, effectively, of our government.
Well, yes, because we've heard of a lot of leaks, haven't we, in recent weeks and months from the cabinet. But this is different. National Security Council, everybody on it has to sign the Official Secrets Act, don't they? It's much more serious what is discussed there. There are issues, as the name would imply, of national security.
Absolutely, and I think that's why the reaction in this case has been much stronger than in the case. It's sort of, leaks on other issues have sort of almost become de rigueur in the last sort of 2-3 months. As Isabel says, collective cabinet responsibility is just broken down, and you've got all of these Tory leadership hopefuls vying for privileged position in the press, and that's why we've seen so many leaks of late. But this really feels like it's stepping it up a gear, and I think what's quite interesting is you've had a couple of members. There are only, I think it's 9, is it, members of the National Security Council?
9 ministers.
9 ministers, that's right. And so you've had a couple, Gavin Williamson and Jeremy Hunt, come out and deny that they were the source of the leak, which will obviously put pressure on other cabinet ministers who sit on the National Security Council to come out and do the same. And actually, I think most of those 9 ministers are leadership hopefuls. So we do really, it's quite an extraordinary situation, really. This hasn't happened before, and I think it really shows how bad things have got at the heart of government.
And if we move on to the Telegraph, I think others have come out and made comments as well, according to them. They're saying that Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary, has said that the leak, is quite difficult to read, was completely unacceptable. Sources close to Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, and Penny Mordaunt, the International Development Secretary, both said they categorically deny being the source. So others are coming forward and saying that they deny it too. And it's not certain yet that there will be a criminal inquiry, is there? But there will be some kind of, certainly an investigation.
There evidently has to be an investigation. Whether it finds anything is another question. I mean, whether somebody, I very much doubt it was a direct leak by a cabinet minister who attended that. It's much more likely that a cabinet minister's special advisor, for example, or another aide may have briefed briefed journalists. That would be a much more normal way of these things happening, in which case that would draw in aides to these members of the National Security Council also being investigated.
And it would give cabinet ministers a bit of deniability, wouldn't it?
It would, absolutely. And we've seen in the past, in fact, in scandals past, not directly similar to this, where you've ended up having the special advisor taking the fall for a cabinet minister. Now, it may well be that a leak was sanctioned by the cabinet minister, but having it done by someone else at least gives that level of deniability. I think it's interesting also in this context of what authority the Prime Minister has, and actually because the leak inquiry will be led by Sir Mark Sedwill, it's not being led by, it's not being ordered by the Prime Minister herself. She's not taken a very personal role in this, I don't think. And that's significant because she basically has no authority now. I mean, there is no real respect for her collectively, or even on the part of individual cabinet ministers. This is unlike anything I have ever seen before in terms of the status of a Prime Minister. She's not a lame duck Prime Minister. I mean, she's almost there in name only, really, isn't she?
And the Telegraph, of course, the paper that originally broke this story, they will be very keen to protect their sources, of course. They will want to resist any pressure to reveal them.
Yeah, I think that's...
In the interest of press freedom.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, they will, absolutely. So, I think the police investigation will focus very much on who did the leaking kind of from the other side, really. But yeah, it's just... as Isabel said, it's kind of quite an extraordinary state of affairs, really, and just shows...
I mean, that said, it's an immensely serious decision that the government has taken. You can look at this another way. I mean, I, as a kind of voter, feel quite grateful that I know that the government has taken this decision, and that I'm aware that they've taken this decision against the advice of so many cabinet ministers and indeed the Americans. And that, I think, is important information. It probably is important information for voters to have. So there may be many people who feel, never mind the process of this, they're not so concerned, they're just glad to know.
OK, let's move on to page 2 of the Metro next, because there's a story there about the next leader after Theresa May goes. We don't know when that'll be, of course. And this is the Foreign Secretary suggesting that the next leader should be
him.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Very convenient, huh? And actually, Jeremy Hunt is interesting, I think, because he's really sort of tried to portray himself as an out-and-out Brexiteer, somebody that, that Tory members can trust with delivering Brexit. But those with long memories will remember that he was a Remainer. And I think there may be a certain... Any Tory leadership sort of hopeful really has to try and appeal to Leave supporting members of the Conservative Party because they're very much in the majority. We know that the sort of biggest proportion of people who voted Leave nationally sits within the Conservative membership, really, out of all the political parties. So it's quite a transparent pitch in some ways that he's making. And the question is it credible?
Well, is it credible because he would say, I can unify people, I understand...
No. Listen. Tory MPs are not going to fall for this again. Those that supported Brexit do not need a long memory to remember that Jeremy Hunt was a Remainer. They are not going to make that mistake again. They made that mistake with Theresa May. They allowed a Prime Minister to take office. They allowed the former Home Secretary to become Prime Minister, to lead the Brexit negotiations when she had not voted for Brexit herself. Look how that's ended. It has not worked well. That's not going to happen again. So, yes, it's not surprising that Jeremy Hunt, a minister for whom I have the greatest respect, I think he's a great minister, but he's a Remainer. No one's going to fall for this sudden change of heart. He is not going to win that.
And meanwhile, turning to the page 2 of the Financial Times, it's actually a different story that we're going to talk about. It's actually about Theresa May abandoning hope of a vote next week. So what does happen next? Because there has been some talk that she might bring her withdrawal agreement back.
I think that's a really good question. And to be honest, I was very surprised when all this talk started doing the rounds in Westminster this week that potentially the Prime Minister was going to table her withdrawal bill next week, because nothing has changed. She hasn't got the support in Parliament for it. She can't even get a motion in favour of the withdrawal bill through. So this idea that she was going to put this incredibly complex, unwieldy legislation through Parliament and somehow a majority was going to appear just seemed quite incredible to me. And I think it's a sign of really bad expectations management by Number 10, which we've seen plenty of in the last few months. The idea that the whips and Number 10 were even putting this idea about was quite sort of fantastical to me. Of course she's abandoned hope of a vote next week because she knows it's not going to get through.
And very briefly, we ought to go to a break, but very briefly, what is happening with Brexit now?
No one knows. No one knows, not even in government, I'm afraid. They don't know. There is an impasse here. The only way to break this logjam is almost certainly for the Prime Minister to quit, and she's not listening.
OK, we will take a break there, but don't go away. Coming up, why unvaccinated children could be banned from school. We'll be discussing that in just a moment. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott. And we're going to turn to the front page of the Telegraph next, because there's a small story down at the bottom there. Unvaccinated children could face school ban. This is Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, saying he couldn't rule out the possibility that children who hadn't had MMR not being allowed to go to school. Is that what he said?
There's a lot of concern in government and the NHS at the moment. A new UNICEF report out today about the number of children who are going unvaccinated, and it's significantly lower. 88% have the 2 doses of the vaccine compared to the 95% that you really need to eliminate measles amongst the population. And measles is an incredibly serious disease. And really this suggestion from Matt Hancock, this idea that kids can only go to school if they've had their vaccinations, it comes from some states in the US where they say you can only go to, kids can only go to public schools if they've been vaccinated. Some European countries do it as well. And in New York, where they've sort of declared a bit of a public health emergency, they've introduced it as an emergency measure. I think the difficulty is, I'm sympathetic to the idea of compulsory vaccination, just because, if parents don't vaccinate their kids, we know it's safe. If parents don't vaccinate their own kids and the population level of vaccination goes down, all kids, lots of kids are at risk. But the problem is, how do you implement it? How do you know which kids have been, vaccinated? Are you going to punish 5-year-olds who haven't been vaccinated by not excluding them from school? I think it's a really tricky policy to implement.
So my guess would be the Health Secretary is making a point here rather than genuinely suggesting that the government would go down this route. I think it would be extraordinarily controversial, be very difficult to get legislation through. And I think you'd get into the territory of human rights. I don't know what the legislation, ultimately human rights legislation, would say about this, but you could definitely imagine that there would be multiple legal challenges about whether, people could be forced to vaccinate their children. The sentiment is a valid one. I mean, 88%, as Sonia said, is not enough for what they call herd immunity against these conditions. And it does seem extraordinary that we are still where we are on this all these years after the controversy over the so-called MMR jab. I mean, that goes back sort of 15 years or something, doesn't it? And all the claims that were originally made have been now debunked. But I mean, at the time, it was a big deal.
And yet there's still plenty of material on social media where these are being repeated, aren't these stories?
And the tricky thing is how you combat that. So we know from research that once parents start to see this stuff on social media, it can be very, very difficult to counter, because actually once you start trying to myth bust, that just reinforces the original kind of ideas that the MMR is unsafe, which is clearly wrong in parents' minds. So I think how you win sceptical parents' hearts and minds over to a vaccination like the MMR is a really, really key challenge for public health.
OK, and one we'll hear a load more about, I'm sure. Let's just finish up with the front page of the Financial Times, and it's actually their picture story there at the top. Climate protest targets the city. This is, of course, Extinction Rebellion. I think it's 10 days, or it says here 11 days, of trying to cause a disruption by staging sit-ins in London. Today, we've seen this extraordinary picture of them gluing themselves together.
I mean, they have been incredibly effective at seizing the media agenda, and the coverage they've had has been very, very impressive in a way. Sonia and I were intrigued as to how you go about supergluing yourself to something, and what exactly have they glued where and how?
It actually looks like, now that photo is blown up, that they've superglued their hand to the stone. Which just
pretty painful.
Very painful, yeah.
Getting it off again.
But yes, and I think the protests are going to end for the moment, aren't they? But
they are. But I think
they've achieved a lot.
Exactly.
I would say, actually.
Yeah, I agree.
A 16-year-old leader is incredible.
Yeah,
the profile that she's now got globally is extraordinary.
Yeah, and interesting to see MP's reaction yesterday as well. It'll be interesting to see whether any change
does it result in anything rather than more hot air.
That's the thing to watch. Yeah. See what you did there.